In the dark days of World War II, when nations trembled under the shadow of tyranny and the fate of the free world hung by a thread, there lived a man whose weapon was not a gun or a bomb, but something far more powerful. His weapon was his mind. While thousands of soldiers prepared for battle on distant shores, this quiet genius sat in a secret room filled with papers and machines, listening to messages that seemed like gibberish to anyone else. He was racing against time itself, trying to crack a code that protected the most dangerous secrets of the enemy. What he discovered would change the course of history forever. He would predict a battle before it happened, giving his country the chance to prepare for an attack that could have destroyed everything. This is not just a story about war. This is a story about one man who proved that intelligence can be the greatest weapon of all, and how a single breakthrough in a hidden room saved thousands of lives and turned the tide of the most devastating conflict the world had ever seen. Joseph Rochefort was born in Dayton, Ohio, in 1898, at a time when America was just beginning to emerge as a modern power on the world stage. His childhood was ordinary in many ways, but even as a young boy, Joseph showed signs of extraordinary intelligence. He loved puzzles and codes, spending hours creating secret messages that only he could understand. His parents noticed that their son had a mind that worked differently from other children. He could see patterns where others saw chaos. He could solve problems that seemed impossible to everyone else. As he grew older, this gift would become more than just a childhood hobby. It would become the foundation for a career that would make him one of the most important figures in American military history. Joseph did not come from wealth or privilege. His family was working class, and they valued hard work and determination above all else. These values shaped Joseph into a man who never gave up, no matter how difficult the challenge became. When he finished school, he knew he wanted to serve his country, but he also knew that his true talent lay not in physical combat but in the world of intelligence and strategy. In 1918, Joseph Rochefort enlisted in the United States Navy, eager to serve his country during World War I. Though the war ended soon after he joined, his time in the Navy opened doors he never imagined possible. The Navy recognized his exceptional intelligence and soon placed him in roles that required careful analysis and problem-solving. Joseph thrived in this environment. He was not the kind of man who sought glory or recognition. Instead, he found deep satisfaction in solving complex problems that others could not crack. The Navy eventually sent him to study the Japanese language, a decision that would prove to be one of the most important moments of his life. Learning Japanese was incredibly difficult. The language was completely different from English, with thousands of characters to memorize and complex grammar rules that seemed to make no sense. But Joseph approached this challenge with the same determination he had shown throughout his life. He spent years studying, practicing, and immersing himself in Japanese culture. He became one of the few Americans who could read, write, and speak Japanese fluently. This skill made him invaluable to the Navy, especially as tensions between the United States and Japan began to grow in the years following World War I. As Joseph continued his work in the Navy, he was introduced to a field that would define the rest of his career: cryptanalysis, the science of breaking codes and ciphers. This was a world where every letter, every number, and every symbol could hold a hidden meaning. Enemy nations used codes to protect their most important secrets, and cryptanalysts like Joseph worked tirelessly to break these codes and reveal what the enemy was planning. Joseph discovered that he had a natural talent for this work. His mind could see patterns in seemingly random sequences of letters and numbers. He could recognize when something was out of place or when a particular pattern appeared more frequently than it should. Breaking codes required patience, creativity, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. Joseph had all these qualities in abundance. The Navy sent him to various stations around the Pacific, where he continued to develop his skills and build his reputation as one of the best cryptanalysts in the American military. He worked long hours, often staying up through the night as he wrestled with particularly difficult codes. His colleagues admired his dedication and his brilliant mind, but they also noticed that he was a quiet, humble man who never boasted about his achievements. He simply did the work because he knew how important it was. Throughout the 1930s, Japan became increasingly aggressive in its foreign policy. The Japanese military conquered large parts of China and began to build an empire across the Pacific. American leaders watched these developments with growing concern. They knew that conflict with Japan was becoming more likely with each passing year. The United States had important interests in the Pacific, including the Philippines and other territories, and these would be threatened if Japan continued its expansion. Joseph Rochefort understood the situation better than most because he had spent years studying Japan and its culture. He knew how the Japanese military thought and how they operated. As tensions increased, the Navy assigned Joseph to lead a special intelligence unit at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. This unit was known as Station Hypo, and its mission was to intercept and decode Japanese communications. The work was incredibly challenging because the Japanese used sophisticated codes that changed frequently. The main Japanese naval code was called JN-25, and it was considered one of the most difficult codes in the world to break. Joseph and his team worked in the basement of a building at Pearl Harbor, surrounded by machines and papers, listening to radio transmissions from Japanese ships and bases. Every message they intercepted was like a piece of a giant puzzle, and Joseph's job was to put all the pieces together to see what the Japanese were planning. On December 7, 1941, Joseph Rochefort and his team were still working to fully break the JN-25 code when disaster struck. Japanese planes attacked Pearl Harbor in a devastating surprise assault that destroyed much of the American Pacific Fleet. Thousands of sailors and soldiers died in the attack, and America was suddenly thrust into World War II. For Joseph and his team, the attack was a painful reminder of why their work was so important. If they had been able to break the code sooner, perhaps they could have warned military leaders about the attack and prevented the tragedy. The failure haunted Joseph, but he did not let it paralyze him. Instead, he threw himself into his work with renewed determination. He knew that the only way to honor those who had died was to make sure such a surprise could never happen again. In the weeks and months following Pearl Harbor, Joseph and his team worked around the clock to break the Japanese codes. They analyzed thousands of intercepted messages, looking for patterns and clues. They worked in terrible conditions, often in sweltering heat with poor ventilation, but they never complained. They knew that every message they decoded could save American lives and help win the war. Slowly but surely, Joseph and his team began to make progress on the JN-25 code. They discovered that the Japanese used a complex system where each word or phrase was represented by a 5-digit number, and these numbers were then further encrypted using mathematical operations. Breaking this code required not just intelligence but also intuition and creativity. Joseph had to think like the Japanese code makers, anticipating how they would try to protect their secrets. He also had to deal with the fact that the code changed regularly, meaning that every breakthrough was temporary. As soon as his team figured out one version of the code, the Japanese would introduce changes that rendered their work partially obsolete. Despite these challenges, Joseph never gave up. He developed new techniques for analyzing the messages, using statistical methods to identify patterns and probable meanings. He also trained his team to work efficiently, assigning different people to focus on different aspects of the code. By early 1942, Station Hypo was reading about 15% of Japanese naval communications. This might not sound like much, but it was enough to start understanding Japanese plans and strategies. Joseph knew that they were on the verge of something big. He could feel it in his bones. The Japanese were planning something major, and if he could figure out what it was, he might be able to give American forces the warning they desperately needed. In the spring of 1942, Joseph and his team began noticing increased Japanese radio traffic referring to a location designated by the code letters AF. The messages suggested that the Japanese were planning a major operation against this target, but nobody knew what or where AF was. Different intelligence analysts had different theories. Some thought AF was in the Aleutian Islands near Alaska. Others believed it might be somewhere in the South Pacific. Joseph, however, had a different idea. Based on the context of the messages and the units involved, he believed that AF was Midway Atoll, a small but strategically important island in the Central Pacific. Midway was about 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii, and it served as an important American base. If the Japanese could capture Midway, they would have a forward base from which to threaten Hawaii and possibly even the American West Coast. Joseph knew that if his theory was correct, this would be the perfect opportunity for the American Navy to prepare an ambush, but he also knew that he had to be absolutely certain. If he was wrong, American forces might be sent to the wrong location, leaving the real target vulnerable. The pressure on Joseph was enormous. Military commanders were skeptical of his conclusion because other intelligence sources disagreed with him. He needed proof. Joseph Rochefort came up with a clever plan to prove that AF was indeed Midway. He arranged for the American garrison on Midway to send out an uncoded radio message, reporting that their water distillation plant had broken down, and they were running short on fresh water. This message was deliberately sent in plain language so the Japanese would intercept it. Then Joseph and his team waited and listened to Japanese communications. Within days, they intercepted a Japanese message stating that AF was short on fresh water. This was the proof Joseph needed. AF was definitely Midway, and the Japanese were definitely planning to attack it. Joseph immediately reported his findings to Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander of the Pacific Fleet. This was a critical moment because Joseph was asking the admiral to trust him and commit valuable resources based on his analysis. Admiral Nimitz had to decide whether to believe Joseph's intelligence or listen to other analysts who disagreed. The stakes could not have been higher. If Joseph was right and the admiral acted on his intelligence, the Americans could set a trap for the Japanese fleet. If Joseph was wrong, American ships might be sent into a disastrous situation. Admiral Nimitz looked at the evidence, listened to Joseph's reasoning, and made his decision. He would trust Joseph Rochefort and prepare for a battle at Midway. Once Admiral Nimitz decided to act on Joseph's intelligence, the American Navy began preparing for the battle with remarkable speed and efficiency. Joseph continued to intercept and decode Japanese messages, providing updates on the Japanese plan. He learned that the Japanese were sending 4 aircraft carriers along with numerous other ships to attack Midway. The Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto believed that the attack on Midway would draw out the remaining American aircraft carriers, which could then be destroyed in a decisive battle. Yamamoto thought he would have the element of surprise, but thanks to Joseph Rochefort, the Americans knew exactly what was coming. Admiral Nimitz gathered every available ship and plane to defend Midway. He positioned 3 American aircraft carriers, the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, northeast of Midway where they could ambush the Japanese fleet. The American forces would be outnumbered, but they would have one crucial advantage. They knew when and where the Japanese were coming. Joseph continued to work around the clock as the battle approached, providing intelligence updates and answering questions from military commanders. He barely slept, surviving on coffee and adrenaline. His team at Station Hypo was performing brilliantly, but Joseph knew that everything depended on what happened next. All the intelligence in the world would be worthless if the American forces could not execute their plan. On June 4, 1942, the Battle of Midway began exactly as Joseph had predicted. Japanese planes attacked Midway Island in the early morning, but American forces were ready and waiting. The real battle, however, took place at sea between the aircraft carriers. American planes launched from their carriers and searched for the Japanese fleet. The battle was chaotic and confused, with both sides making mistakes and experiencing both luck and tragedy. But the Americans had one critical advantage that made all the difference. They knew where the Japanese carriers were because of Joseph's intelligence. American dive bombers found the Japanese carriers at a vulnerable moment when their planes were being refueled and rearmed on the flight decks. In just 5 minutes, American bombs struck 3 Japanese carriers, setting them ablaze. A 4th Japanese carrier was destroyed later that day. The Japanese lost 4 of their best aircraft carriers along with hundreds of experienced pilots. The American victory at Midway was overwhelming and decisive. Japan would never recover from these losses, and the balance of power in the Pacific shifted dramatically in favor of the United States. Back at Station Hypo, Joseph and his team listened to the battle reports with a mixture of relief and jubilation. Joseph had done it. He had predicted the battle, given his country the information it needed, and helped achieve one of the most important victories in American military history. In the days and weeks following the Battle of Midway, military leaders and historians began to understand just how important Joseph Rochefort's intelligence work had been. Without his analysis and his correct identification of Midway as the target, the battle might have gone very differently. The Japanese might have achieved surprise and destroyed the American carriers, giving them control of the Pacific for years to come. Instead, thanks to Joseph, the United States won a stunning victory that changed the course of the war. Admiral Nimitz praised Joseph's work and recommended him for the Distinguished Service Medal, one of the military's highest honors. However, not everyone in the Navy was happy about Joseph receiving so much credit. Some officers in Washington who had disagreed with Joseph's analysis were embarrassed that he had been right and they had been wrong. These officers worked behind the scenes to block Joseph's medal and to diminish his role in the victory. This political maneuvering hurt Joseph deeply. He had never sought glory or recognition for himself, but he felt that his team at Station Hypo deserved acknowledgement for their brilliant work. The fact that petty jealousy and bureaucratic politics were denying them this recognition seemed terribly unfair. Despite this disappointment, Joseph continued his work with the same dedication as before. After the Battle of Midway, Joseph Rochefort continued to lead Station Hypo and provide valuable intelligence to American forces fighting in the Pacific. His team's work contributed to many more victories as American forces gradually pushed the Japanese back across the ocean. However, the political battles in Washington continued to make Joseph's life difficult. In the fall of 1942, despite his proven record and the critical importance of his work, Joseph was reassigned away from Station Hypo. The officers who were jealous of his success had finally succeeded in removing him from his position. Joseph was sent to other assignments that did not fully utilize his unique talents. For a man who had contributed so much to the war effort, this treatment was deeply unfair and frustrating. Joseph could have complained or gone to the press to tell his story, but that was not his way. He was a military man who followed orders and did his duty without complaint. He continued to serve his country in various capacities for the rest of the war, but he never again had the opportunity to make the kind of impact he had made at Midway. After the war ended in 1945, Joseph continued his naval career for several more years before retiring. He lived a quiet life, rarely speaking about his wartime achievements. Most Americans had no idea who he was or what he had done. For decades after World War II, Joseph Rochefort lived in obscurity, while historians and military analysts gradually came to understand just how important his role had been in the Battle of Midway. Books and articles about the battle began to mention his name and describe his intelligence work. Veterans of the battle spoke about how the intelligence had given them the advantage they needed to win. Slowly but surely, Joseph's reputation grew, even as the man himself remained humble and quiet. He never sought publicity or tried to promote himself. He believed that he had simply done his job, and that was enough for him. However, others who knew about his contributions felt strongly that he deserved proper recognition. Admiral Nimitz, until his death, maintained that Joseph Rochefort was primarily responsible for the victory at Midway. Other military leaders who had worked with Joseph also advocated for him to receive the recognition he deserved. The campaign to honor Joseph properly took many years. The military bureaucracy moved slowly, and there were still people who resisted giving Joseph credit because it would reflect badly on their own wartime decisions. But the evidence of Joseph's crucial role in the victory was overwhelming, and eventually, justice could no longer be denied. In 1986, more than 40 years after the Battle of Midway, Joseph Rochefort finally received the recognition he deserved. President Ronald Reagan posthumously awarded him the Distinguished Service Medal that Admiral Nimitz had recommended back in 1942. Joseph had died in 1976 at the age of 76, so he never lived to see this honor, but his family received the medal on his behalf. The ceremony was emotional and bittersweet. Joseph's daughter accepted the medal with pride and sadness, knowing that her father should have received this recognition during his lifetime. Military officials at the ceremony acknowledged that Joseph had been treated unfairly and that his contributions to the war effort had been invaluable. The belated award of the Distinguished Service Medal helped set the record straight. Historians now universally recognize Joseph Rochefort as one of the most important figures in American military intelligence history. His work breaking the Japanese codes and predicting the Battle of Midway is taught in military schools around the world as an example of how intelligence can be decisive in warfare. Students of history learn about Joseph, alongside the admirals and generals who led forces in battle, because his contribution was just as important as theirs. Joseph Rochefort's story had a profound impact on how modern militaries think about intelligence. Before World War II, many military leaders viewed intelligence work as secondary to combat operations. The brave soldiers and sailors who fought on the front lines were considered the real heroes, while the analysts and codebreakers who worked behind the scenes were often overlooked or undervalued. The Battle of Midway changed this perception dramatically. It demonstrated beyond any doubt that good intelligence could be the difference between victory and defeat. Joseph's work showed that one person with a brilliant mind and the right information could affect the outcome of a battle just as much as thousands of soldiers with guns and bombs. In the decades since World War II, every modern military has invested heavily in intelligence capabilities. The United States created the National Security Agency to focus on signals intelligence and code breaking, carrying on the tradition that Joseph and his team pioneered. Intelligence analysts became recognized as essential members of the military team, not just support staff. Today's military operations rely on intelligence even more than they did in Joseph's time. Satellites, computers, and sophisticated surveillance technology provide information that Joseph could never have imagined. But the fundamental principle remains the same. Understanding what the enemy is planning gives you an enormous advantage. Joseph Rochefort proved this principle at Midway, and his legacy continues to influence military strategy around the world. While we celebrate Joseph Rochefort's achievements and his crucial role in winning the Battle of Midway, it is important to remember the personal cost of his work. Joseph spent years of his life working in difficult conditions, often for long hours with little sleep and under enormous pressure. The stress of knowing that thousands of lives depended on his analysis must have been almost unbearable at times. His work required him to be away from his family for extended periods, missing important moments in the lives of his wife and children. The political battles he faced after Midway also took an emotional toll. Being denied recognition for his achievements and being reassigned away from the work he loved must have been deeply painful. Yet Joseph never complained publicly or allowed his personal disappointments to affect his dedication to duty. His story reminds us that behind every great achievement in history, there are human beings who make sacrifices that often go unrecognized. The thousands of people who worked in intelligence during World War II, many of whose names we will never know, contributed to victory in ways that were just as important as the actions of soldiers on the battlefield. Joseph's humility and dedication serve as an example of selfless service that transcends personal ambition or desire for recognition. The story of Joseph Rochefort and the Battle of Midway teaches us lessons that remain relevant today, more than 80 years after those dramatic events. One of the most important lessons is that intelligence and preparation can overcome even significant disadvantages in numbers or equipment. The American forces at Midway were outnumbered by the Japanese, but they won because they knew what was coming and prepared accordingly. This lesson applies not just to military situations, but to many areas of life. Whether in business, sports, or personal endeavors, having good information and using it wisely can give you an advantage over opponents who might seem stronger or better equipped. Joseph's story also teaches us about the importance of trusting experts and listening to people who have deep knowledge in specialized fields. Admiral Nimitz made the crucial decision to trust Joseph's analysis even though other people disagreed. This decision required courage and good judgment, but it paid off enormously. In our modern world, we face many complex challenges that require expert knowledge to address properly. The story of Midway reminds us that we should listen to and trust people who have spent years developing expertise in important fields. Another lesson from Joseph's story is the importance of perseverance in the face of difficulty. Breaking the Japanese codes was an incredibly challenging task that required months and years of patient work. Joseph and his team could have given up many times, but they kept pushing forward because they believed in the importance of their mission. Today, the Battle of Midway is remembered as one of the most decisive naval battles in history. Visitors to Pearl Harbor can learn about the battle at museums and memorials that honor the sailors and pilots who fought there. The story has been told in numerous books and films, each trying to capture the drama and significance of those crucial days in June 1942. Joseph Rochefort's role in the battle is now prominently featured in these accounts, though for many years his contribution was barely mentioned. Modern historians have worked to ensure that his story is told accurately and that his achievements are properly recognized. The intelligence building at Pearl Harbor, where Station Hypo once operated, is now a historic site, and visitors can see where Joseph and his team worked to break the Japanese codes. For those who study World War II history, Joseph Rochefort represents the often invisible heroes who worked behind the scenes to achieve victory. His story reminds us that war is won not just by courage and firepower, but also by intelligence, strategy, and careful analysis. The quiet genius who sits at a desk solving problems can be just as much a hero as the soldier charging into battle. Both types of courage and dedication are necessary for victory, and both deserve our respect and remembrance. In the end, Joseph Rochefort's story is about the power of the human mind and the difference that one person can make. He was not a general who commanded armies or a president who made grand political decisions. He was a humble naval officer who loved puzzles and had a gift for seeing patterns that others missed. But his intelligence and dedication at a crucial moment in history saved thousands of lives and helped ensure that democracy survived its greatest test. The Battle of Midway was a turning point in World War II, and that battle was won because Joseph Rochefort correctly predicted where and when it would happen. His brilliant analysis gave American forces the advantage they needed to defeat a powerful enemy and begin the long march to final victory. Though he faced injustice and disappointment during his lifetime, history has vindicated Joseph Rochefort and recognized him as one of the true heroes of World War II. His legacy reminds us that intelligence, careful analysis, and dedication to duty are just as important as physical courage and military might. In a world that often celebrates flash and drama, Joseph's quiet brilliance stands as a testament to the power of thoughtful, patient, expert work. He proved that one person with the right knowledge and skills, working diligently in service of a greater cause, can indeed change the course of history. The codebreaker who predicted a battle before it happened gave his country and the world a gift beyond measure, and his story will continue to inspire future generations who face their own seemingly impossible challenges.